Now that we've talked about what happens at the level of a single muscle fiber as a muscle contracts, I want to zoom out so that we can get a look at the behavior of the whole muscle. To start with, it's important to know that each muscle is innervated or gets its signal from a certain nerve. A nerve is a bundle of neurons. Most of the nerves in our body are what are called mixed. They have some neurons bundled up in there that are carrying signals from the body back up to the brain, and there are other neurons bundled up in there that are carrying signals from the brain out to the body. The neurons that are carrying the signal from the brain out to the body are called motor neurons, and those are the ones that we're interested in because motor neurons are what control skeletal muscle. The cell bodies of these motor neurons are found in the spinal cord, and then the axons of the cell bodies exit the spinal cord and travel bundled up in a nerve out to the muscle that they're going to control or innervate. One muscle is innervated by many motor neurons. There are lots of different neurons that are going to innervate one muscle. Once the nerve or the bundle of axons gets to the muscle that it's going to innervate, the motor neurons divide and go out to their individual muscle fibers that they're going to innervate. Each muscle fiber is innervated by only one motor neuron, so it's only controlled by a single neuron. But each motor neuron can control more than one muscle fiber. All of the muscle fibers that are controlled by a single motor neuron are called a motor unit, and they work together as a unit. When that particular motor neuron sends the signal to contract, that signal goes simultaneously to all of the muscle fibers in the motor unit, and all the muscle fibers in the motor unit contract at the same time. We call that all or none. Motor unit contraction is an all or none deal. Either all of the muscle fibers in the motor unit contract or none of them do. Muscle contraction is not necessarily an all or none deal. And that's because within a single muscle, you could activate some motor units, so some of the cells in the muscle are contracting, but not all of them, so other cells in the muscle would not be contracting. Some muscles have very large motor units, and what I mean by that is that a single motor neuron innervates a lot of muscle fibers. Some motor neurons can innervate up to 1,000 individual muscle fibers. That makes for a pretty big motor unit. The advantage to large motor units is that you have a lot of strength in that. Even activating one motor unit will contract a lot of muscle fibers and lead to greater strength. Some muscles have motor units that are so small that a single motor neuron will only innervate 3 or 4 muscle fibers. That's just a few cells controlled by that motor neuron. The advantage to this is that it gives you a lot finer control. You can really change the strength of the contraction in very tiny increments. This is important in muscles that have to have finer control to carry out their work. For example, the dexterity in our fingers or the ability to move our tongue in order to shape words. In these cases, having small motor units gives much finer control of movement than we would find if we had large motor units. In addition to being able to control the strength of the contraction depending on how many different motor units are activated, having different motor units in a muscle also helps with preventing fatigue. It's possible to maintain a contraction for a longer time when you can sort of switch between motor units as they get tired. So if I'm trying to hold up something that's not particularly heavy so I don't have to use all of my motor units, some motor units are activated and some motor units are still relaxed. As the motor units that are activated begin to get tired, I can switch to activating other motor units and let those first ones relax for a while. And then once the next ones are tired, the first motor unit should be ready to take over again. Let's look at what happens in a muscle when it receives a signal to contract. If the muscle receives a single stimulus, just one zap for it to contract, we see that the muscle contracts and relaxes. When a muscle receives the stimulus or the electrical signal to contract, it activates an action potential within those muscle fibers. That's what we can see in the first part of this figure. This is showing you the electrical charge of the muscle. We can measure the electrical charge with electrodes. You can see that there's a signal to contract, and then we have a big spike, a big change in the membrane potential, and then that comes right back down. When we have that single spike in the membrane potential, we can see what that does to the muscle itself by looking at the second part of this diagram. The second part down here shows us the tension, or the amount of force generated as the muscle contracts. And you can see here that that force goes up, and then it comes back down. And then it sort of follows the actual stimulus. So we have our stimulus, the action potential that shoots up really fast, and then the muscle contraction. This single cycle of muscle contraction and relaxation is called a muscle twitch. A muscle twitch is one cycle of contraction and relaxation of a muscle as the result of a single stimulus. If we take a look at the larger graph, you can see that once the stimulus occurs, marked here at time 0, there's a little bit of a gap before we actually see any change in tension. That's what's called the latent period. This is the short delay between when the signal occurred and when we see any muscle contraction at all. And this latent period is due to all of the things that have to happen before we actually start the contraction. We have to open those sodium-gated calcium channels and change the membrane potential. We need to have that signal go down the T-tubules and open the calcium receptors of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We have to have the calcium leave the sarcoplasmic reticulum and bind to troponin in order to move tropomyosin out of the way, and then we can begin the process of contraction. So that's why there's a short delay between the signal to contract and any actual contraction occurring. There are a lot of steps that have to happen in there. Once we get past the latent period, we get to the actual contraction phase. This is where our myosin is pulling along the actin and actively shortening the muscle. And you can see that the tension increases as we continue to go through those steps of grab, pull, release, reach over and over again to pull the actin along the myosin and shorten the muscle. Remember that the stimulus to contract was just a single quick signal and then gone. So while this contraction phase is going on, we're already starting the steps that are going to lead to the relaxation. So while we're still contracting, we've stopped the nerve signal, we're getting rid of all the extra acetylcholine, we're starting to reset the membrane potential, we're actively pumping the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Once all of those things have been accomplished, we stop the contraction phase, and the myosin is let go of the actin, the active sites are recovered by the tropomyosin, and we begin relaxation. During the relaxation phase, the muscle is returned to its resting length, and we can see that the tension decreases back down to the baseline. In real-life muscle use, a muscle twitch is very uncommon. Very rarely do we get a quick stimulus to contract and then it stops and we're all done. Usually, we're trying to maintain a contraction for some length of time or vary the strength. So let's look at how the stimulus can help change the strength of the contraction. Let's look at the top figure on this screen. The top figure shows what happens in the muscle when we have a gradually increasing stimulus strength. So we start out with a stimulus that's relatively weak, and then each stimulus is a little bit stronger. Remember that this signal is an electrical stimulus being applied to the muscle in order to stimulate a contraction. So we can change the strength of the stimulus simply by increasing the voltage. Notice that in the beginning, when we have a weak stimulus, there's no contraction at all. No contraction, no contraction, no contraction. That's because when the stimulus is this weak, it's not strong enough to cause an action potential in the muscle fibers. And if we don't cause an action potential in the muscle fibers, there's not going to be any contraction at all. We need to have a stimulus that's strong enough to open enough of those sodium channels to trigger an action potential. So we get enough of a membrane potential change, it'll open the voltage-gated sodium channels and then spread that signal across the muscle fiber to actually trigger the contraction. A stimulus that is strong enough to cause a muscle contraction strong enough to start an action potential is called a threshold stimulus. So these weaker ones are below the threshold. They're not going to cause a muscle contraction. It takes a stimulus at least this strong in order to trigger contraction. Next, notice that as the stimulus gets stronger, we get a stronger muscle contraction. We get more tension produced. That's because the stronger we make the signal, the more motor units we're activating. And the more motor units we're activating, the stronger the contraction is going to be. That continues until we get to the point where all of the motor units are activated. Once all of the motor units are activated, it doesn't matter how much stronger we make the stimulus, the contraction can't get any stronger. You may recall that I said a muscle twitch is not that common in normal life. Instead of just a single contraction and relaxation, we want to contract for a length of time. And in order to achieve that, we have to change the timing of the stimulus. Instead of just one signal and done, we need to signal from the neuron in order to maintain a muscle contraction. The bottom half of this screen shows what happens to the strength of the muscle contraction as we increase the stimulus frequency, as we make the stimulus faster. At first, we can see that if the stimuli are spaced apart, we get that muscle twitch that we saw before. There's the stimulus, we contract, and then we relax. When we start putting them a little bit closer together, we can still see the spike up. So we get the contraction and then it relaxes, but then the next time we have another one, it contracts a little bit stronger. And then the next time even a little bit stronger. And that's because there's not time for a complete relaxation within the muscle fiber. It gets all the way back to its normal length. That's why we don't see any more tension. But there's still some extra calcium in the sarcoplasm. And that means that with that extra calcium available, when the next contraction comes through, we're going to be able to contract a little bit faster and get more of a contraction in the same amount of time. Once we start spacing the stimuli even closer together, you can see there's not time for the muscle to relax fully. It can't get back to its original resting length. We can see the spike up, and then it starts to relax, but before the muscle fiber can get back to its resting length, it gets another signal and spikes up again. And before it can get back to resting length, it gets another signal and goes up again. So now we're starting to maintain a little bit more steady sort of contraction. Finally, when we put the stimuli very close together, there's not time for the muscle to relax at all in between the pulses of calcium being released, and so there we have a steady contraction. That's what's called tetanus. Tetanus is a prolonged muscle contraction caused by having stimuli that are frequent enough that there's no time for the muscle to relax at all in between. One last thing to point out on this is that as we continue, there's a point where the muscle tension drops off, where the muscle stops contracting, even though the signals have continued. So here we can see the continual signaling. We're still getting the stimulus to contract, but the muscle stops contracting. At that point, we say the muscle has fatigued. Basically, it's run out of energy. It's run out of the ability to contract. So even though we're still getting the signal, the tension drops because the muscle can't contract anymore. And you may have experienced this before. If you were trying to hold or carry something heavy, and you're holding it, and you're holding it, and you're doing it, and you're holding it, and you're holding it, and then despite the fact that eventually you are still trying to hold this heavy item, you just can't do it anymore. The muscle fatigues and it's done contracting.